Welcome back, everyone. In the previous video, we saw the setup of Plato's dialogue Euthyphro, and we examined some of the definitions that Euthyphro gives. Now, in the second part, we want to examine the third definition and talk about the problem that it creates, and I think you're going to see that it's pretty interesting. Now we come to the third definition. Recall in the earlier video that when Socrates is questioning Euthyphro, Socrates points out that if we say that piety is what the gods love, well, different gods agree about or disagree about what piety is. So we need a definition to get around that. So Euthyphro gives the following definition. Piety is what all the gods love. Okay, let's examine it. Now, Socrates approves of this definition. It meets the standard he wants, but he points out to Euthyphro that the definition is actually ambiguous. It could mean one of two things. And in fact, what Socrates is going to do is clarify and ask, okay, so which question are you asking, Euthyphro? And in fact, what comes next is one of the most famous passages in philosophy. Here goes. Socrates asks, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is the pious pious because the gods love it? Now, what does this mean? That's going to be the big question. And to get at that, I want to illustrate this in a couple of different ways. So first of all, let's take a common case. Recall earlier that in the dialogue, we noticed that this problem does not just apply to, well, piety. It applies to lots of other concepts like beauty or justice. So for example, just to take an everyday example, if I have a pair of Crocs, the shoes, are those Crocs ugly because people think they're ugly? Or do people think they're ugly because they're ugly? The second way I like to think about this problem, you can almost think of it like a chicken and egg question, and I like to call this the two becauses. So we can set up two statements and they say, well, something is a certain way because of something else. Well, in this case, we'd say, well, is something ugly because people think it's ugly? Or, this is the alternative, do people think it's ugly because it's ugly? And so really we're trying to figure out which of those things is primary. Now for us, this is going to raise a real problem because as you're going to see, this problem applies to all kinds of things and all kinds of different problems in philosophy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you know that you've got a really good philosophical problem when you take a position, you try to answer it, but that leads you into further problems. So what I want to do next is take a look at what happens if you choose either answer to the question. Okay, so first of all, let's look at the answer that says, if the pious is pious because it's loved by the gods, what happens then? Well, then the gods loving something is the reason for it being called pious. So whenever all the gods love something, that thing becomes pious. So piousness and being loved by the gods then turn out to be the same thing. However, though, we still don't know why the gods love that thing, and so the account seems to become arbitrary. The gods could have loved something else, and that thing could have become pious. Should also add here at the end, Socrates is not happy with this answer because at the outset, he assumed that piety and being loved were going to be two different things, right? But this actually makes them into the same thing. For something to be pious just is to be loved by something. Okay, let's look at the other approach. Now, on the other hand, if the pious is loved by the gods because it's pious, then the reason why the gods love the pious is that it possesses a particular quality. Let's just call that piousness, whatever that is. However, we still don't know what that thing is, and we would still need a definition. And it's important to note that whatever that definition is, it would turn out to be independent of the thing or person who judges it. In this case, it would be independent of the gods. Now, I think ultimately the question is going to be, which side do you agree with? Which answer do you think gives a better answer to the problem? Well, here at the end then, I want to give you a couple things to think about in trying to answer it. Now, first, let me give you a thought experiment. Imagine or suppose that you go to your favorite art museum and your favorite painting is hanging on the wall. So say Botticelli's Venus or the Mona Lisa or whatever. Or choose an ugly painting. It's up to you. Now the question is, let's suppose further that some kind of zombie apocalypse happens and all the humans who would go to the museum are gone, right? They've been replaced by zombies. And let's say that zombies, they don't care about art, they only care about brains. Now, the question then is, if this happens, if all the, art fans go away, is the painting still beautiful? And I think the way to think about this is, go back to the two options we looked at earlier. Does either option tell you that the painting is still beautiful? And I think if you find an answer to that, that may give you a clue to which answer you prefer. Now finally, here at the end, I'd like to make a confession. In asking the question at the beginning, I've actually done something a little sneaky. However, I want to point out that really the question that's being asked, the way Plato asks it, it only gives you two options. And so that might raise a question for us, which answer we think is better, but notice that that assumes that there are only two answers to the question. Now, Plato, I think, does this on purpose, right? There's supposed to be one question, or one answer to the question, and that's his own, which we might call some kind of realism. There are things in the world, call it piousness or beauty or whatever, and that, if you want to call it a form, that form makes things have the values they do. The alternative to that is what we would sometimes call relativism, which is to say, there are no independent values in the world. Really, it's more like the eye. Beauty, if you've ever heard this phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? It's like that. But I want to point out and emphasize here that in only giving you two options, this might make us ask, well, why not have a third option? For instance, why not try to blend the two? And believe it or not, other philosophers have actually attempted this approach. And so I would encourage you to investigate that, especially if you're not satisfied with the two answers that Plato has given you. All right, that does it for now. Thank you for watching the video. I really appreciate your time. I'll see you all in class and in the discussion boards.